he was closer to Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president for 4 years after Putin stepped down from the presidency the first time, and had served as a sort of proxy, we now understand. But at the time, it seemed like Putin was perhaps, in fact, passing on power to the new generation. And while he remained on the political stage, he was eager to create the impression that there was a constitutional order that was being followed. And Pavlovsky was one of those people, among many Russians, I think, who embraced that, admired Putin for his courage in stepping down. Not many leaders do that. The equivalent would be George Washington in our case, somebody who could have stayed on as king or president for life, but he decided he didn't want to do that. But when Putin announced that he was coming back, people saw that as kind of a ruse. And Pavlovsky, who had been, again, very instrumental in Putin's power, but also supported this transition, was quite embittered by the process. In this long interview he gave, he described Putin as a zero, which I thought was really striking. How could this man who had been, astride power in Russia for so many years, be something, a non-entity? And he went on to explain that what he meant is that Putin was a screen, sort of like a projection. He said it was where we project our desires, our love, our hate, which I thought was really a striking thing to say. Like, how could he be all those things to people? Wasn't he the great leader? And I realized as I began to think about this and explore Putin more in depth as I began to write the book, that this was a characteristic of Putin's that he developed very early in his life in some ways. And it was one that I think was very much like the country itself. The Soviet Union collapsed, and you had to rebuild an image of the country. Like, what would it become? The new Russia, what would it be? The Soviet Union obviously failed for lots of reasons, and Putin understood those. And like the country itself, he wanted to sort of recreate himself in this image. I say all this with some degree of hindsight, because Putin was obviously not destined to be in power. In fact, I think he's sort of an accidental president in a lot of ways. But early on, he discovered, I think through his career in the KGB as an officer of the Secret Service, this ability to create an image for himself. By necessity, he had to win over people. He once claimed to one of his colleagues, actually a friend of his, who asked him, what he did. And he said he was an expert in human relations, which meant that, he worked on winning people over, essentially trying to persuade them to cooperate with security services. I think all of you will remember, or most of you, some of you might be too young to remember, the anecdote when George W. Bush, first met him, and said that he had got a sense of his soul. Poor George Bush was ridiculed for this, and I think himself was embarrassed, I know, from talking to him about it a bit. But I'll tell you a little bit about that story, because I think it's really revealing. The Bush, when he ran for president in 2000, was critical of the way the Clinton administration had handled Russia. Felt like they'd missed a lot of opportunities, that had been too weak, too accommodating to the Russians. The Republican dream at the time was to build missile defenses, a national missile defense system, which was prohibited by treaty. And this was a dream of the Republicans, to build a national missile defense system, and it was the highest priority of the Bush administration when they came into office. And yet Bush very much wanted to sort of to use a bad word, restart relations with the Russians in his administration. Though he had been very hawkish on the campaign trail, he wanted to come in and try to start things fresh. Because under the Clinton administration, when Putin first came to power, relations were pretty much on the rocks. And so the two leaders met in Bratislava, Brno, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that, in Slovenia. And they both made a big deal out of this first encounter. And when leaders meet, there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes that you probably don't realize in terms of preparation. There's a lot of staff work that goes into it. They're very, they're careful about analyzing what they want to say, what message they want to do, and these meetings are a lot less, like you and me meeting, but they're very formal, very formulaic. Each side gives its points and all this. And in the meeting, Putin was very effective in sort of unarming Bush, if you will, charming him, frankly. He said to him, because Putin's understanding of Bush, at least the intelligence that he had shared with him, that had been shared with him, that he studied before this meeting, he wanted to connect with him on a personal level. So he mentioned to Bush when they first met, and Bush tells this story in his memoirs, as do his aides, Condi Rice, Karen Hughes, that Putin talked to Bush about being a rugby player at Yale, which is funny because when I read that I thought Bush wasn't a rugby player, but it turns out he had been for a year. But Bush was actually much more famous for being a cheerleader at Yale, but Putin wouldn't know what a cheerleader was or meant, but rugby he could understand, right? So he complimented Bush on being a rugby player, and Bush, being not as dumb as some people thought he was, he understood immediately what was going on. He said, "Very good brief," and so he understood that Putin had read his intelligence brief on on Bush, and was trying to use that as a way to sort of connect with him. And again, poor George Bush, he got so much grief for this that I actually want to give him a little credit and read what he actually said, because Bush had done his homework too. And in his briefing, he read a story, which I include in the book, of course, about Putin really at the low moment of his life. I don't want to give away the whole book, but in 1996, Putin had come back from the Cold War, if you will. He'd been an intelligence officer in Germany, and he returned to St. Petersburg, then still Leningrad, but now the new St. Petersburg. He worked for the Democratic mayor, one of the true Democrats of Russia, a guy named Anatoly Sobchak, was a very close ally of Yeltsin, was instrumental in resisting the putsch in 1991 that eventually led to the end of the Soviet Union. And so a lot of people talk about like Putin's KGB career as a defining moment, which is absolutely true. But there was also this period when he worked for one of the great Democrats of the new Russia, and he absorbed a lot from him as well. And one of the things he absorbed was that elections are really unpleasant affairs because sometimes you lose them. And Anatoly Sobchak ran for re-election as governor of St. Petersburg and lost. And he lost because he ran a terrible campaign. And it really embittered Putin. It embittered him partly because one of the guy that the governor lost to was one of the other deputy mayors. The deputy governor's titles are a little confusing, but basically a colleague of Putin's ran against the boss, and Putin saw this as ultimate betrayal. How could you possibly challenge your own the man responsible for your position. And he even called the man a Judas in public. And when Judas won, Putin was out of work. And apparently Putin wanted to stay on, but it was impossible. And so in 1996, he would have been 42, 43 years old. He was out of work. He had no political prospects. And at that point, his dacha, which is the summer house that many Russians have, burned down. So he really lost everything: his career, his life savings, even the one home that he owned, burned to the ground. And Putin tells this story about going through the ashes of this house that he had outside of Petersburg and finding a cross that his mother had given him. It was made of tin or some metal, and somehow miraculously it had survived the fire, and he was able to save it when he was picking through the ashes of the house. And Bush read this story, and Bush, being a real believer, religious believer, was touched by that story and asked Putin about it. He's like, "Tell me about the cross." And that disarmed Putin in a way. And Putin then repeated the story. He said at the time, as Putin told the story, he'd never taken the cross off afterwards, though at that particular moment in the meeting he wasn't wearing it. But soon afterwards, and there it is, he claimed and often wore this cross. And Bush was quite touched by that. And being again a believer himself, I think he was really quite moved and felt like he'd found a sort of soul mate. And I'll read the quote. I won't do the accent anymore. But the quote, I think, it has been unfairly characterized, because he didn't really say he saw his soul. What he said was, "I looked the man in the eye," Bush said. "I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy," which is something that many of them in the administration would like to have had back. He said, "We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul, a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country." And I don't think that Bush was wrong about that. I think that is truly what motivates Putin. How sincere was it? The story of the cross, it's not for me to judge exactly, but there's no question that Putin is very adept at being an expert in human relations, as he put it, and he uses it to great effect, especially when he's meeting world leaders. There's another famous story of when he met Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, who had been elected having defeated Gerhard Schroeder, who was a very close personal friend of Putin's, and came to be anyway. His wife had helped the Schroeder family adopt a Russian child. They were very closely aligned kind of politically, and it was this moment early in Putin's presidency when I think there was a great deal of optimism that there would be a closer relationship developing between Russia and Europe. And then, again, these pesky elections. Schroeder stood for re-election and he lost. And Putin sees this as just abhorrent. How could such a good man as Gerhard Schroeder not have been re-elected? And I think that, and the fact that he's probably a little bit misogynist, meant he really didn't like Angela Merkel when he met her. So the first time he meets her, he brings in this dog of his, Coney, a black Labrador, knowing full well that Angela Merkel is terrified of dogs, hates them. And here in his first meeting with her, Coney comes bounding in, sniffing around her legs. The Germans were, of course, appalled by this. But he said to her, supposedly, I don't even know if this is true, I know everything about you. which is a kind of creepy thing to say to somebody who grew up in East Germany, right? I met the dog, by the way, Coney, which is relevant in the sense that when I was there, I asked for an interview with Putin, and I was, I'm just a mere bureau chief. They said I couldn't possibly have an interview with Putin, but maybe if the, executives of the New York Times came. So I invited Bill Keller, who was our great executive editor at the time, and a former correspondent in the Soviet Union, won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And he agreed immediately to come, so they assented, and we had this interview lined up with him. And a couple days before the interview was to happen, I got a frantic call from the Kremlin saying, we need a history of the New York Times. And I was like, wow, where am I going to get a history of the New York Times in Russian? So I made one up. And I basically said, the New York Times was founded in 1851. I'm doing this off the top of my head as I did then. And it's since, I think it's 1898. It's been owned by one family now, known as the Sulzberger family, that they're great stewards of the New York Times as a public interest. No fear, no favor. That it was the greatest newspaper in the United States, better than the Wall Street Journal, and all these things. I just wrote and sent it off to them. And when we arrived for the interview, Putin addressed Bill Keller first, of course, being the senior person, and he began by saying, it's such a great pleasure to meet somebody from the New York Times. The Sulzberger family treats the New York Times as a public trust. And wouldn't it be great if our oligarchs here in Russia treated journalism as seriously as the Sulzberger family does? And Bill Keller, who's no slouch, was absolutely smitten. He was like, wow. And it was only afterwards, as we were driving back into the city, that I said, Bill, listen, I sent them that letter. But it shows how he does his homework and how he uses it to great effect to win people over. And I don't want to get ahead of it, but we see some of that going on, I think, even now. I tried to, by the way, to get another interview with Putin for the book. I've interviewed him twice, for the Times. One of my favorite questions I asked him if he ever regretted anything about his service in the KGB. He said he could look in the eye anybody he had worked with, which I took to mean that he hadn't killed anybody. But I wanted to interview him again for the book, specifically because I had questions once I began to research about his history, his early biography, and so forth. The man has a fascinating life, and I wanted to know more about that because there are obviously a lot of gaps in our knowledge. There still are, even after having finished. And protests began in 2011. We, again, in the West, broadly speaking, treated this as the march of democracy into autocratic regions, and yet he seethed. He saw it as a completely different perspective than what we did. I was in Iraq at the time when they started, and I remember in the Arab world in particular, it felt like a breath of fresh air was coming because these are very autocratic societies, very repressive politically, and people wanted to voice their aspirations for greater freedoms, economic freedoms, political freedoms, religious freedoms, and so forth. Putin instead saw it as a kind of march of Western values that began not just then, but in Kosovo in 1999, with the NATO bombing in Syria, with the invasion of Afghanistan, which again, I can make a very strong case why we should have invaded Afghanistan when we did after the attacks of 9/11. And in some ways, by the way, then Putin was willing to cooperate, and the Russians gave a great deal of intelligence to the Americans when that bombing campaign began. And there was this moment when it seemed like we were on the same page, but when it turned to the war in Iraq, Putin began to say, wait a minute, this is American power, exercising itself, not for justified reasons. And he began to then see, when the events happened in Ukraine in 2004, which, by the way, completely presaged what happened 10 years later in 2013-14. And he began to see this as a conspiracy. And I used to think that it was kind of political, that like it's easy for him to whip up his base in Russia by being anti-American. It's like it's a cheap win for him. But when the protest erupted in 2011, again in Tunisia first, then in Egypt, Libya, then the NATO intervention, that happened right at this moment when he announced that he was coming back. And it was not popular, to be honest, for him to return to power in 2011. They announced it in September, the year of the Arab Spring, and his presidential election was the next March, 2012. But there were parliamentary elections before that. They were clearly rigged. There was quite widespread evidence of ballot stuffing. There were videos of it, and people poured into the streets. And when that happened, I happened to be traveling with Hillary Clinton at the time, covering the State Department. He said publicly that Clinton had given a signal to the protesters. I'm going to try to find the exact words that he said. Because I remember being, again, with Clinton at the time, and she was just stunned by this. She'd met him, and she thought, they had pursued the reset in the beginning of the Obama administration, the first term, and were really eager to improve relations again. By the way, not unlike Bush when he first came to office. And Putin, when these protests began, she criticized the conduct of the elections, and he came out and he said, she set the tone for some actors in our country and gave them a signal. They heard the signal, and with the support of the State Department, began active work. And active work is a jargon from the KGB times for intelligence operations. So basically, he was saying that Hillary Clinton had ordered an intelligence operation to begin in Russia to undermine his march to the presidency a second time. And again, I thought, like, that's crazy, I mean, not that I know Clinton that well, but I'm pretty sure she didn't give that signal. She wouldn't, the State Department really doesn't run active work. That's the other agencies that do that. But even those agencies weren't involved in it, and I know I'm pretty good authority. And yet he saw it that way. And I sometimes think that, like, it's easy for us to dismiss what he was thinking because we think it's nuts, or we think it's not grounded in reality. But that's the reason for what happened last year in our election, is that he felt like the Americans were intervening in Russia's internal political process, so he would do the same. And I don't think that the activities, and some of this is in some dispute right now, but the intelligence agencies are pretty clear that that there was an effort made by Russian intelligence agencies using the leaks through WikiLeaks, using social media and so forth. They were trying to disrupt our election. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that I know that senior law enforcement people think that it was not actually about supporting Trump per se, but really not supporting Hillary Clinton. The effect of which, as Michael McFaul yelled at me once, is the same. He's a former ambassador who was very close, worked for the Obama administration, worked for the Clinton campaign. But that was, I think, the motivation that Putin had. He felt like they had interfered in our process, so therefore we had a right to interfere back in theirs. You mentioned, Donna, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which just passed, by the way, unnoticed officially in Russia, and which is striking because it's a huge, I shouldn't say unnoticed, the Communist Party had a party. There was an exhibition at the Hermitage, but officially from Putin's government, it passed without any official ceremony or occasion, and I think that was partly because they don't want the whiff of revolution to be in the air right now, because Putin faces an election next year, and there is a great deal of uncertainty, I think, that they feel about what is happening or could happen. Since I've moved to China, which I just arrived in June, I've been thinking a lot about this notion, Putin's notion of sort of ideology, and going back to what I was saying before about him sort of creating an image for himself. Xi Jinping right now is trying to revive the Communist Party, which frankly seems ridiculous. I work in a building in Beijing with a Mercedes showroom in it, and outside the showroom there's this big electronic billboard, like something you would see in Times Square, extolling socialist values. And I often ask people when I get a chance to ask officials, like, what do you mean to be a socialist now? This is like the most capitalistic place that I've ever been. They're trying to figure out some way, I think, to revive the notion of Communist Party, control over a society that is thoroughly capitalistic. And I think Putin has been trying to do the same thing, and has been struggling somewhat, frankly, to come up with a new ideology. Part of it is nationalism, and he talks about nationalism in a way that has become, my words are failing me here, he defines nationalism in a way of being against the Western values in some respects. And I wanted to read a quote that he made describing, this is around the time that the war in Syria was really erupting. Putin said, referring to us, basically, they are denying moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, even sexual. They are implementing policies that equate large families with same-sex partnerships, belief in God with the belief in Satan. The excesses of political correctness have reached the point where people are seriously talking about registering political parties whose aim is to promote pedophilia. And I read passages like that, and I go back to what Peskov said, like, you want me to take that seriously? Because for a long time I thought, like, he was trying to create this new identity of Russia as something in opposition to, liberal Western values. And yet, I think, honestly, I don't think this is what he really believes. Or maybe it is now what he believes. And we're seeing a sort of glimpse into his soul the way that Bush did. And he's become a little less guarded in how he portrays himself. But I remember also in one of the interviews I had with him, when he talked about Russia being Europe, and Europe being Russia, that they were inseparable. So this notion that he's creating, or he's trying to create, I think, is this idea that Russia is somehow now different than what do you want to call it, the liberal Western establishment or worldview. And honestly, I'm not convinced that it is. And I think, certainly from the Russians I know, politics aside, questions of gay marriage aside, or what have you, I don't think many people think the way that he does, or at least not a majority. Or if it's a majority, it's not an overwhelming majority. There are many people who see a sort of universalist view of the world. And I think the problem now is that Putin is still very much trying to find this new ideology, and this leads him into these kinds of dead ends, because of the sanctions, because of the annexation of Crimea, he has to be wholly anti-American, though most Russians I know are not. And so I think he's created this notion where I sometimes talk about history to him is like a smorgasbord or buffet. It's sort of depending on his mood. He samples a little of this, a little Tsarism, a little Sovietism, and every day it's kind of changing a little bit depending on the circumstances. But frankly, I don't think it's sustainable. I mean, what Putin has created is a Russia that is Putin. And one of his advisors said as much. He said, there's Russia and there's Putin. Without Putin, there's no Russia, which is absurd, because of course Russia will endure beyond Putin. We're all mortal, and there will be another Russia, and yet I don't think they've quite found the path to sustain what it is, and it's coming. The moment when that is going to become an important inflection point, because again, he faces re-election in March. I think he'll win unless something extraordinary happens. And then the clock is ticking on his, again, second legal term. And he could do what he did before and appoint a successor and stay on in power in some respects. But at some point, he's not going to be with us anymore. And Russia will have to then figure out a new system that can survive him. And again, when I say I think he's one of the most important world leaders right now, it's because of that. There's no country, I think, maybe North Korea would be an exception, where the future of the country depends so much on one person. There's news today, which I haven't checked on in a few hours, Mugabe, a guy who's been in charge of Africa for how many years? He's 93, and but the end always comes, and then what happens, and what's going to happen in that country, which isn't nearly as important as Russia, of course. And that moment is coming. Talking about the people around him. Another guy like that was Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated. And sadly, I think one day we're going to hear the same about Navalny. Because but he fights on. It's really admirable what he's doing. It's not for me to say if he'd be a great president or not. I'm not so sure he has the experience to be, but the fact that he is trying to challenge this sort of closed and corrupted society in a way resonates with Russian people, because they see what's going on around them. They know that Putin's childhood friend got another $10 billion contract. And most people will say, yeah, well, that's how it works. Your buddy is in power, of course you get all the contracts. But a lot of people also look and say, well, but our roads aren't being fixed. And he's hitting that seam, and it's very effective, I think. He's been convicted now 2 or 3 times, I lose track, in these show trials, which technically, legally disqualifies him for running for office. Certainly the presidency, but he's campaigning as though he could still run, and I think he's creating enough of a political constituency that he could survive, if he survives this, that he could emerge as a very important player if the system ever loosens up a bit.